Can a SIG P320 be carried safely in a Kydex holster, or are you just asking for trouble? Hey everybody, Yankee here. The other day when I was making a video talking about how the P320 can be volatile, so you have to be very careful with it, especially if you're using a Kydex holster. A lot of people balked when I said that and said, well, what's a Kydex holster got to do with it? There's no way a Kydex holster is less safe than a leather one, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, yes, in the comments when I answered them, I said, yes, sometimes a Kydex holster can be more dangerous with guns like the P320 simply because of how they usually work. They usually grab on around the trigger guard, and they usually press in around that trigger guard, and that can put pressure on the trigger. And of course, that triggered some people who started screaming, I've never seen a holster that actually touches the trigger, never, ever, 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 ever. And I was like, well, you know, it's okay that you haven't seen a lot of holsters in your life, but a lot of the holsters do that. As you can see, this one right here does that. You can actually see the imprint of the trigger right there. Here's another one from a reputable maker, and you can actually feel the trigger right there. You can see that it's molded around the front and the back of the trigger, just like it is on this one. And that's not uncommon. Now, in most cases, like with the PX4 Storm, which this holster is for, that's not going to matter. That trigger is not light enough to be activated by that little bit of pressure right there. And it doesn't have a short enough travel that even if it was activated by that little piece of travel right there, that it would actually go off. It would still be very safe. But with a SIG P320, you don't really want that pressure on the trigger, period. The trigger is too light and the travel is too short. Anytime that happens, you can have problems. Like here, if we look at a cross section from another very popular holster maker, you can see right there, there's an imprint where the trigger rests. That is okay for the gun this is made for. This is not a SIG P320 holster. This would be fine for this gun, but for a P320, I wouldn't trust that because it does touch the trigger, obviously, and there's a piece up here that sticks in further than the actual part that touches the trigger. That could be something that could activate that trigger while you're holstering it. Which brings us to how much of the trigger is actually covered here. In most holsters, there's no reason for a guard to come up above the back of the trigger. Anything beyond that, to me, is a risk of activating the trigger with the part of the holster that's up higher than the trigger. But in the SIG P320's case, I almost think a full coverage is necessary so that you don't get your finger pinched between the trigger and the side of the holster, because it wouldn't take much effort to do that and set the gun off. So on a SIG P320, it's the one gun I do say needs to have coverage over the entire trigger guard. But with the P320, one thing you do have to make sure of is that it is wider all the way down to the trigger than it is where it touches the trigger. Because if it's narrower anywhere up here, you really run into a chance of trouble, and you do have to be careful not to use the side of the holster, the piece sticking up, to activate a trigger accidentally. But otherwise, like I said, as long as it covers everything and it's narrower down there where the trigger is than it is up here, you really probably won't have a problem. But to demonstrate what I'm talking about here, look how narrow this holster is up here at the top. It's actually narrower right here than it is down here where it touches the trigger. On a SIG P320, this could actually fire the gun. So this holster would not be a good holster for the SIG P320. Another thing you have to worry about in Kydex holsters is extra movement, because since they do grab around the trigger, or at least put pressure where the trigger is, they need to be fully molded to the gun. If I can't see what gun it is by looking at the outside of the holster, I'm probably not going to carry that Kydex holster. These manufacturers that make these generic holsters and then just kind of re-engineer the interior for the specific gun, I don't like that. That doesn't give me a lot of confidence that that gun isn't going to move further than it should. And if you move further than you should in one of these holsters, let's say it's not tight enough here or not tight enough down here, or maybe just open down here, then you can get excess movement. It can activate that trigger. The gun can go off. And like I said, that ain't good. Now, there are some exceptions to that rule, like this here holster from Hogue. It doesn't actually have a total molded front here, and it's open at the bottom, but it blocks that trigger guard completely. If you look at the side here, that trigger guard can't go anywhere beyond where it's supposed to go, and it uses a locking mechanism to hold it in place until you actually squeeze this, so it doesn't touch the trigger. You notice this isn't molded in. There's actually a little bar that comes across and locks in, and the gun just can't go down far enough that the trigger touches the little bar. Because, like I said, this covers the whole front face of the trigger guard and it locks in there, can't go any further than it's supposed to. This right here would be an acceptable holster for the P320. In fact, if I was going to carry a P320, this would probably be the holster I would use. Now, I don't want to give the impression that every holster that uses a cross bolt catch there is good for the P320, because I don't think they are. This holster is very similar to that one. You know, it's not really fully molded to the gun, and it does have an open bottom, but it does use the cross catch there, that little cross bolt catch to hold the gun in place, but it doesn't block the whole trigger guard. As you can see here, this doesn't support the entire trigger guard. It just holds it a tiny little bit on each side, not much at all. And if this holster ever became cracked or worn or anything like that, it could allow that gun to move a little further down because it would spread out, and then that cross bolt could activate the gun. So I wouldn't carry it with this holster. Now, I trust this holster with most every other semi-automatic gun I have, but not with a P320, simply because of what can go wrong there without having that trigger guard fully supported, so it can't go any further than it needs to. And keep in mind here, pretty much all these things I'm showing you are specific to the P320. Most guns, like the guns it's made for, that wouldn't be a problem. But the very fact that it's got a little bulge in right here before the trigger, that could be a problem with the P320. The gun this is made for, this is fine. But if you're going to be carrying a P320, make sure none of your holster touches the actual trigger. Not in any way. And as I've shown you here today, a lot of them do. Now, this is a Glock, not a P320, but I want to show you here. Make sure when you get you a holster for the P320 that it blocks that entire trigger guard or blocks the entire front of the gun from moving down any further than it needs to move down. Get one that doesn't touch the trigger in any way, because that can be a hazard with the P320. But even when it doesn't touch the trigger, be extra careful, especially if you're carrying inside waistband, because it doesn't take much to get in there, a little piece of cloth or anything. And if it comes between the trigger and the Kydex, well, the Kydex is rigid and ungiving, so what's going to move first? The trigger is going to move first. That can make it go off. But as long as you aren't putting anything in there that shouldn't be there or letting anything get in there that shouldn't be there, and you're watching your fingers when you actually holster the gun, and you're making sure the top part isn't narrower than where the trigger is, you should be fine. Like I said, this one right here is probably what I would use. This is from Hogue. It's got the lever release. I like that way better than the touch release up here. Another reason is because a lot of times when people are using the touch release up here, as they're drawing, where's that finger go? It touches their trigger, and that could be really bad with the P320 because it don't take much of a touch to make it go off. So I'd stay away from systems that work on the front of the gun that require you to put your fingers near the trigger while you're drawing. And like I said, make sure it just doesn't touch the trigger. Make sure you don't let anything get in there. Make sure the top isn't too narrow. And then if you do all those things, if you make sure all that works and you make sure that the mechanism itself in here doesn't have any chance of touching the trigger, the gun is held securely, it's not some sort of generic shape, you should be okay with the P320 in a Kydex holster. But like I said, you got to be aware of potential issues.